program, who is organizing this series of webinars. We want to give a special thanks as well to grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees, GSER, who is co-sponsoring this session. We will have a space in the end for question and answers. So please keep your comments and think about questions and comments you might have, and you can share them meanwhile in the chat, but you can also directly ask them to the speakers at the end of the webinar. This is the second webinar in a series of 8 that we are organizing this year from Hispanics in Philanthropy, and it's called Centering Frontline Voices Across the Americas. We are organizing this series together with funders and partner organizations. I already mentioned GSER for today's session. We want to have participative conversations about topics related to migration in the region. And we are organizing these discussions around 3 thematic areas. The first are the invisibilized and complex situations that affect migrants in the region. We analyze these from an intersectional perspective, considering racial equity, gender, and climate justice. An example of this was the webinar we organized last month around the Haitian and Venezuelan migration. A second area of concern is about the opportunities that migration offers to our societies and about the importance of voices of the people directly impacted by migration. And the third, and this webinar today is part of this area, is about policies. Today we want to speak about the immigration and border policies at the US-Mexico border and how they impact migrant families and how they continue to cause family separations and put families at risk and cause trauma. So for this discussion, we have invited experts today, and we are very proud to collaborate with them. So I would like to introduce first our moderator for today, who is Isela Pelayo. She works for Kellogg Foundation. She's a program officer on racial equity and community engagement to support thriving children, working families, and equitable communities. Before joining Kellogg, she has a wide experience also working for the education policy sector in New Mexico, leading multicultural and bilingual education programs. Thanks, Isela, for helping us lead the discussion today. And I would like to introduce our speakers who work all at important organizations that protect migrants at the border and in the United States. First, I would like to introduce Erika Piñeiro. She's an immigration attorney and the litigation and policy director of Al Otro Lado, a direct service nonprofit organization who works at both sides of the border. Thank you, Erika, for joining us. She will share a little bit about what is the current situation at the border and the risk of family separations. We also have Dora Melara, who is an attorney working in Honduras with the organization Justice in Motion. She's part of the defender network that Justice in Motion created in Central America. She will help us understand from San Pedro Sula the situation of the families in Central America. We also have Aurora Pedro. She works for Comunidades Indígenas en Liderazgo, or Cielo, which is an indigenous women-led nonprofit organization that works with migrant indigenous communities in Los Angeles. She is also the coordinator of the Center for Indigenous Language and Power and an interpreter for English and Acateco. Thanks, Aurora, for joining. And we also have, I think she will connect a bit later, but I would like to introduce her now, Dr. Linda Lopez, who is a CEO for Impact Strategies and also a consultant for Casey Family Programs. She has over 20 years experience and is as a strategic consultant and an expert in immigration and refugee integration. She will share some lessons about the experience of Casey working with migrant children and child protection authorities. Thanks everybody for joining us. I would like to give the floor now to Isela to share the perspective of Kellogg Foundation and lead the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Jose, and welcome everybody. Really glad to be here with you today to help facilitate this conversation. Again, thanks for organizing and convening us today. Super honored to moderate this panel of amazing mujeres leading and doing critical work in the community. This topic is really important to the Kellogg Foundation because of our belief that all children should have an equal opportunity to thrive and realize their full potential. Our mission to support children and families and communities as they strengthen and create conditions that propel vulnerable children to success as individuals and contributors to their communities and society. And so we also believe that people have the inherent capacity to make changes in their lives, organizations, and communities. And this really drives our racial equity and community engagement approaches and lens to the work that we do. And so if you're wondering, well, why does the Kellogg Foundation care? What is relevant about this border and immigration policy session today? Well, when we say that our mission is to support children, families, and communities, this includes migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers too. We believe children and families belong together, and that's how they thrive. And they are not able to thrive if they're separated and in detention centers. And when we talk about strengthening and creating conditions for thriving children, or working families and equitable communities, this includes paying attention to border and immigration policies and their implementation, because these create conditions that negatively impact the well-being of children and families, and actually create some dire conditions that then require healing from trauma and harm. And so these issues are relevant and they matter because we support communities in transforming systems and societal structures into ones that affirm the inherent value of all people. This is a humanity issue, not a political one. And the Kellogg Foundation values community wisdom and leadership, recognizing that meaningful and enduring change must be driven in by for community, and particularly those directly impacted by systemic racism, inequality, and oppression. And since community is closest to the issues, community is closest to the solutions too. And so it's with that humility that I enter into the conversation today with our esteemed experts and panelists to center and amplify community voice and wisdom. So we're going to jump into some questions here. This first part of our conversation, we want to really get a better sense from folks doing this work directly about the current situation and the different needs, perspective on needs. And so we want to just center that reality of family separations in the context of different border and immigration policies. I'm sure you've heard of zero tolerance, Title 42, Migration Protection Protocol, or really the Remain in Mexico policy. But to begin, it would be really important for us to hear a little more from each of our panelists on the current situation. So the questions would be, how are migrant families impacted and what are their needs? And we'll, as you share, just share a little bit about the work that you and your organization are doing, what you're seeing in terms of how migrant families are being impacted and what you're learning about their needs. So we can start with Erika at Al Otro Lado, if you can just share a little bit about your work.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be on the panel with all of these amazing women. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with all of you. So my name again is Erika Pinheiro. I'm the Litigation and Policy Director of Al Otro Lado. I'm here in Tijuana. I've been on the border for the past 5 years, just doing Know Your Rights, helping thousands and thousands of refugees who are seeking asylum in the United States, and also working with families who were separated under zero tolerance. So our organization also works closely with the Family Reunification Task Force to make those families whole. And we also do direct representation in the United States with offices in Tijuana, San Diego, and Los Angeles. So I know when a lot of us think about family separation, we think about zero tolerance, right? We think it's over now. The Biden administration has a task force. Everyone's being reunified, but that is not the case, okay? There are families being reunified, but there are still thousands of families being separated at the border. So I'm going to go into what those separations look like and why they're happening and how it's impacting the families. So I think the first thing we need to talk about is what the definition for a family unit is for immigration authorities, because this really informs who gets to stay together and who's separated. So a family unit is only parents, legal guardians with paperwork, minor children under 18, and a legal spouse, okay? So anyone falling outside of that very strict definition is still being subject to separation on the border. And I'm going to go through a few examples, but just starting with that family unit, right? Those separations are still happening, although not at the volume at which they were happening under zero tolerance. So mostly we're seeing, for example, one parent being released into the United States and another parent and minor child being sent back to Mexico under Remain in Mexico, or a child being separated from their parent and sent to ORR, and the parent is expelled to Mexico or home country under Title 42. These are, again, not happening as often, but Indigenous and Black migrants are being disproportionately affected by those types of separations. And it's really difficult to know the full scope of them because the government really isn't keeping good track of when those separations are happening still. So the other types of separations happening, which I think are not as close to the public consciousness, are these broader family groups being regularly separated. So, parent is traveling with an 18-year-old child and minor children. The parent and minor children are released into the United States. 18-year-old is sent to detention. We just saw this happen with a few Ukrainian families and a few Russian families who are fleeing the current conflict. And these separations number in the thousands. So for example, about a year ago in early 2021, Immigrant Defenders of Los Angeles, which represents thousands of unaccompanied children in Southern California, estimated that between 10 and 17% of the unaccompanied children in their care were separated from extended family members at the border. So grandparents, aunts, uncles, or older siblings. And right now, we're also seeing Ukrainian children who were often orphaned in the war, or their parents stayed behind to fight. They're traveling with a grandparent, having undergone all that trauma and being separated from that caregiver at the border. So this is really a serious and widespread issue that the administration doesn't seem to have any appetite to fix. Another issue we're seeing is parents sending their children alone because of Title 42. So as most of you know, Title 42 has closed the border to asylum processing since March of 2020. And the conditions have really deteriorated greatly on the border. So just as an example, Human Rights First has now tracked at least 9,886 kidnappings, torture, rape, and other violent attacks on people blocked in or expelled to Mexico just during the Biden administration. So you can imagine as a parent being stuck on the border here, why you would want to send your child ahead alone, knowing that they will at least be safe in the United States. And we can argue as to whether it's better or worse for a Border Patrol agent to separate a child or for a parent to decide that this is, the best option for our family, but in either case, it's tragic. Another area of another theme of separation that we're seeing are parents separated from US citizen children at the border. So it's very, very common for Central American, especially Central American or Mexican families to have spent time in the United States previously, have a US born child, they go back to home country, experience persecution, and then are seeking asylum as a family unit at the border. Because CBP cannot detain US citizen children, they call local child welfare services to take the child, and then the parent is usually detained and has to go through removal proceedings. So this is not a small problem. Just to give you a sense of the scope, between 2014 and 2019, San Diego County Child Welfare Services separated 1,114 US citizen children from asylum-seeking parents. And if the parent ends up being deported, this separation can be permanent. And keep in mind that these children are going into the foster care system where they are eligible to be adopted, right? So this is really tragic for parents who are separated in this way. And with these cases, we've also seen disturbing conduct on the part of local child welfare officials. Just to give you an example, in San Diego, they've justified the separation, saying that a parent bringing their child to the border or bringing the child into CBP custody constitutes neglect or abuse. So that's how they're getting the legal basis for separation at the border. So it's really an area that's ripe for advocacy. And the final type of example that I wanted to mention are parents being separated from children after being deported from the interior. So this is a largely overlooked population, but probably the largest group of separated families, right? Millions of people have been deported. There's no tracking of when deported parents are separated from children, but we do have a program here on the ground to help deported parents, and our internal data shows that the majority of these parents were the primary breadwinners for US citizen children in the United States. And this really has devastating effects on the family members who are left behind, especially if the other parent is undocumented, because they're generally not eligible for emergency services. And so we see a lot of these families end up experiencing food insecurity or homelessness or other issues. And this type of separation is also permanent in many cases. Even though deported parents do have rights in US family courts, it's very difficult for them to vindicate these rights or even maintain parental rights at all. They are often discriminated against, and this happens in the context of refugees or people deported from the United States. Parents outside the United States, especially if they have a criminal conviction, are discriminated against in family courts in the United States and often cannot obtain visitation or even maintain parental rights. So I wanted to really just, I'm ending here, but just wanted to point out with these last two examples. So the advocacy community working around family reunification often advocates to have local child welfare services involved at the border to prevent family separation. But as we see with these two examples, that's not just, get them involved and separations will stop. That is not the case. So as we're talking through our advocacy points and thinking about how we can solve these problems, I just want us to think critically and carefully about how we can involve local child welfare systems in a way that preserves family unity for migrant families. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erika, for just grounding us in all of that information and learning so many different things that I was not aware of. So just so thankful to you for getting us started. I will go now to Dora at Justice in Motion. Would love to hear from you what you're seeing in terms of how migrant families are being impacted and what their needs are. Specifically, maybe you can speak to the situation of separated families at their country of origin.
Hola, buenas tardes. Gracias por esta oportunidad. Es un placer para mí pues comentarles un poco desde los países de origen la situación que viven las familias. En los países de origen la situación de las familias es muy complicada. Se encuentran familias en diversas situaciones. Las separaciones de la política cero tolerancia de Donald Trump tuvieron lugar entre el 2017 y el 2021, perdón. Fueron miles de familias las que fueron separadas. En algunos casos, los hijos separados se quedaron en los Estados Unidos y en albergues juveniles o con algún representante. Y hasta hoy en día siguen separados. Hijos y padres han perdido años con sus familias. En otros casos, los hijos separados fueron repatriados después de una separación larga y traumática. En algunos casos, los padres no han tenido contacto con sus hijos porque viven en zonas donde el acceso a internet, el teléfono es bastante complicado. Hay personas que tienen que subir a veces un cerro para poder agarrar señal de teléfono y esto ha hecho que las familias pues se dificulte la comunicación con sus hijos. En otros casos hay llamadas telefónicas de vez en cuando, pero eso no es un sustituto de una vida familiar normal. Desde enero del 2020 al 2021, la administración de Biden ha querido reunir a las familias separadas, pero no es tan fácil como parece. Los hijos han estado separados de sus familias por unos 3 años. Sabemos que 3 años para un niño es mucho tiempo. En muchos casos, el gobierno ha perdido contacto con las familias en el país de origen y en otros casos incluso con los menores que han quedado en Estados Unidos. Entonces, no es tan fácil como ponerlos en un avión y reunir a las familias y que todos vivan felices después de una separación. Bueno, las familias han tratado de escapar de situaciones de peligro y violencia en sus países de origen. No vieron otra alternativa que llevar a sus hijos muy pequeñitos, lejos o a un lugar donde pensaban que iban a estar seguros. Para muchos, la decisión de emigrar no es fácil. Es dejar todo atrás, una vida, familia, amigos y todo lo que envuelve los muchachitos, incluso algunos perder sus estudios y empezar una vida nueva. Pero para muchas familias no hay otra alternativa que tener que emigrar y buscar estar a salvo. Pero en vez de estar más seguras, fueron separados por la fuerza en la frontera. En casi todas las instancias, los padres pasaron semanas sin saber del paradero de sus hijos. Los oficiales migratorios forzaron a las familias a ser separadas, en algunos casos con intimidación, diciéndoles que no iban a volver a saber de sus hijos. Otros padres manifiestan cómo sus hijos fueron arrebatados de sus brazos, y la aflicción de un padre de no saber qué estaba pasando o qué va a pasar con su hijo fue una situación bastante traumática, que hasta el día de hoy aún hay secuelas de todo lo que ellos vivieron. Los padres que fueron separados fueron deportados y regresaron a sus países de origen sin sus hijos. Estos hechos trágicos de perder un hijo o un padre o una madre, de saber de no saber de su hijo y no saber qué pasó con ellos, ha venido a causar daños, estrés, depresión, psicosis y muchos otros que pueden ser a causa de esta situación que no fue fácil para ellos. Para muchos fue incluso hasta como una tortura el no saber de sus hijos, de una madre de saber que su esposo regresaba o el papá de su hijo regresaba sin su hijo y sin darle una respuesta. Fueron situaciones que en muchas familias aún causan daño al recordarlo. También pues los padres están sufriendo trastorno postraumático por esta situación. Muchas veces cuando a los padres se les explica el remedio de retorno, desconfían y no creen que quien los trató de una forma terrible, ahora les esté extendiendo la mano. Y que no pueden creer de que quien hizo el daño ahora los quiera ayudar. Muchas veces desconfían y tienen desconfianza del proceso. Y a veces piensan de que este remedio puede ser hasta una estafa, ¿verdad? Entonces, la situación de los países, de las familias en los países de origen es muy difícil. Además, el remedio de retorno también es muy difícil. La reunificación es necesaria para remediar el daño sufrido a manos del gobierno, pero las familias siguen con las secuelas del trauma, de la separación, y eso es algo que enfrentar y buscar un remedio adecuado. ¿Cómo podemos apoyar a estas familias separadas? Como dije anteriormente, la reunificación es necesaria, pero no es suficiente para reparar el daño causado por las familias forzadas. Primero, hay que reconocer que la reunificación es muy complicada y que las familias necesitan apoyo durante el proceso. Nosotros como defensores de Justice in Motion los estamos apoyando de la manera que mejor podemos. Tenemos trabajo de buscar a la familia, que las familias en los terrenos donde muchas veces hay que subir a pie, hay que dejar el carro, son zonas de mucho que hay que subir, zonas muy remotas a las cuales tenemos que enfrentarnos, buscar apoyo de los líderes locales para poder encontrarlo. Porque muchas veces sí dejaron un lugar, pero tal vez el nombre no fue escrito correctamente, no dejaron una dirección exacta. Entonces nuestro trabajo es recorrer las calles hasta encontrar estas familias, porque nuestro propósito es que estas personas puedan tener este pequeño alivio y puedan reencontrarse con sus familias. Nosotros los defensores servimos como un recipiente para los padres, porque llegamos y creamos un vínculo de confianza, platicamos con ellos y muchas veces las familias incluso se sienten agradecidas de ver que hay personas que están preocupadas por ellos, que hay personas que están buscándoles y muchas veces pues ellos se sienten tan agradecidos que ellos mantienen un contacto con nosotros. Además de hacer todo este proceso de búsqueda, encontrar a las familias, explicarles todo lo que es el proceso, los registramos en juntos.gov y la mayoría de estas personas necesitan una ayuda. Sabemos que son personas de muy escasos recursos que necesitan muchas veces hasta la ayuda para sacar una partida de nacimiento, para arreglar algún tipo de documentación que ellos tienen y muchas cosas que son procesos que a veces ellos desconocen, como el simple hecho de sacar un pasaporte, por ejemplo. Entonces necesitan la guía de nosotros para poderles apoyar y seguir adelante y que ellos puedan confiar, crear esa confianza para que ellos se sientan seguros y que estamos ahí para apoyarles. Encontramos a familias en situaciones muy difíciles. Muchas veces necesitan apoyo psicológico para recuperar un trauma y la separación que ya ha durado varios años. No tienen confianza en el sistema que los ha decepcionado, ¿no? Además de atención psicológica, necesitan apoyo para cada paso que ellos puedan dar para poder reencontrarse con sus hijos. Además, cuando ellos llegan, no es fácil, tanto porque sabemos que han estado mucho tiempo separados de sus hijos. Y los niños ya han tomado o han adoptado que las familias con las que están son sus padres. Entonces, cuando ellos se reúnen, sabemos de que también es otra forma de que ellos van a necesitar esa ayuda para volver a integrar ese vínculo y recuperar el tiempo perdido. Entonces, mejor apoyar a las familias separadas dándoles atención en cada área de sus vidas que ellos necesiten. Igual apoyo psicológico, social, para que puedan seguir sus vidas de una manera saludable dentro de Estados Unidos y en su país de origen. Cierro haciendo un llamado a la acción. Pedimos que apoyen la propuesta de la ley en el Congreso. Familias pertenecen juntas en el número de casa 2766, en el Senado 1375. Esta ley ayudará a reunir familias que fueron separadas durante la política de cero tolerancia. La ley dará residencia permanente para familias que fueron separadas. Ayudará durante el proceso migratorio y una solución permanente para que las familias que sufrieron la tragedia de una separación, solo el Congreso puede dar una solución permanente para que las familias puedan reunirse con seguridad. Es hora que conceder a los niños inocentes la justicia que se merecen. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Dora, por esa explicación y compartir todas las complicaciones y lo difícil que es ese proceso en el país de origen. With that, we'll turn it over to, we'll go to Aurora, who can share a little bit about what it's been like in terms of Indigenous migrants, the needs for services, including language, justice, and healing. So Aurora, please.
Thank you. Yujan Dios ko ayatung cholanti in sala kulal in watch kulal chok ana yatung cholanti yip an wan ket kono wan an imatroh on Tuhan sti I Aurora en chimuna bengun yap al cielo ti. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be a part of this space, part of this panel with different women leaders. I just wanted to share a bit of the work that we do here at Cielo. I'm the coordinator for the Center for Indigenous Languages and Power. What we do at the center is we have seen an increase for Indigenous interpretation, just creating resources, videos, audios, translations in Indigenous languages. And I think that's reflected a lot because of what's going on at the border, the crisis that's going on. Also, we've seen, we work closely with families in understanding and navigating just like the immigration process. And I think one of the biggest needs is just bridging that language gap, just because a lot of the times there is this misconception that folks that or migrants that come from south of the border speak Spanish. And like as an example, my family, Acateco and Anjobal from Huehuetenango, Guatemala, we do not speak Spanish. And growing up, it was just Acateco and Anjobal in our household. So this is very common for Indigenous families migrating from Guatemala, Indigenous communities that are being displaced, that face a lot of, not only from their lands being displaced, but also just being targeted in general, not having opportunities to education. So the other reason I feel like there's a lot of barriers for these families that they face when migrating is just when they do find, or when they do have someone who can advocate for them, or they reach an org, there's also not an understanding of how diverse our communities are. You know, there's a lot of times that I've come across you know, institutions, agencies that have the best intention, but they, just because of data erasure, it's not commonly known that we exist. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard folks tell me, I thought the Mayas disappeared. I thought, you know, the Aztecs and Mayas and all of this were people of the past. So it might seem a little bit just lighthearted, you know, in the media, making up these stories, but these have direct consequences with the services that families get, because if we don't exist on paper, if the data doesn't show that we exist and we're labeled as Hispanic, or we're labeled as Latinos, Latinx, it removes our sovereignty, our culture, our languages. And because of that, there is no access to interpretation. There has been times where, you know, there has been families going to, or a minor, an unaccompanied child going to court, and, you know, not knowing that there's a right to have an interpreter, because why would a child know that? Or thinking that they have to hide that they speak an Indigenous language, and just go along through the process knowing a few Spanish words. And that is a huge injustice and a huge human rights violation, because if you cannot understand the process, if you do not understand even the basic questions you're being asked, how that is definitely going to affect the way that your asylum case is going to be taken. That affects the results. That affects how your sponsor will be able to help you, whether it's like for medical appointments or education. So I think one of the biggest barriers is just showing folks the data that a lot of the migrants that are coming over just from Central America, yes, they're from Guatemala, but simply labeling Indigenous communities or migrants as their nationality does not do it justice, because we are Indigenous people and we have our communities, we have our sovereignty and our languages, and with that, our worldview. So there are also cases where when families come, they get separated, they might not understand what's going on, like when with MPP and Title 42, what's that like? We don't have those words in our language. So to be able to explain that process in simplified terminology has been something that we do as interpreters, that, you know, we ask lawyers or anyone who's providing assistance to these families to be able to explain it in a way that can be interpreted into an Indigenous worldview. So not only that the parents understand, but the family can also understand. And it's also just a very confusing process overall. I think to be able to interpret it is already challenging, but often because the data is not there from step one, with the intake forms, if we even get that far, but with unaccompanied minors, with the intake forms, it's already defaulted in Spanish. And a lot of the questions that are being asked aren't necessarily culturally just aware of how our communities work and our community worldviews are. So a few of the questions might not even be answered, or it might confuse the child to give different answers without an interpreter, which can in turn affect the way that their process for like asylum or visa. So I think a lot of the times, because we're not seen as a population, or we're not documented as Indigenous people, we are not given a right to an interpreter or understanding the information in our language. And the other thing to that is, just the barrier to education that really affected many Indigenous communities during the pandemic. A lot of the information that was being sent out or how things were being handled were not translated or interpreted into Indigenous languages, which further exacerbated the situations of Indigenous communities. And with that being said, it was just a lot more challenging for folks to understand if someone here in the US died from COVID, there was a barrier in having their body repatriated. And that's like a really harsh reality to us, because where in Indigenous communities where you're born, you must be buried as well. So just understanding our right, our sovereignty is something that we continue to struggle with, and we face from every direction. So one of the needs is just to be able to document that we are Indigenous people, and that we do have languages, so we can have a right to interpretation and understanding the information that's given to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurora, for just sharing a lot more about the additional care that we need to do around being culturally and linguistically appropriate and responsive to the communities that are needing services. Really important, and making that finer point on the way that we're just not serving everyone in the same way well. I'll turn now to Linda to maybe talk to us a little bit about how migrant families are being impacted, what their needs are, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the traumatic impacts on children. So we'd love to hear from you about that.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, HEP and team, for inviting me to this really important conversation. I wanted to share a little bit more about my work with Casey Family Programs. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Casey Family Programs, I'm a strategic consultant for them now. They started in 1966, and they operate in 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and also with tribal nations across the U.S. in North America, to influence the well-being of children and families as well. Can you all hear me? I feel like, okay, good. Thank you. I had a spotty internet connection earlier, so please let me know if you can't hear me. So the mission of Casey Family Programs is that every child deserves a safe, supportive, and permanent family, that every family will thrive with the support of a caring community, and that every community can create hope and opportunities for its children and families. And so you might be wondering how Casey Family Programs is involved in this effort, particularly as it relates to unaccompanied minors, but more broadly to ensure that Latino families in particular and children are protected in the child welfare system. So I'll give you a little background. I started working with Casey Family Programs almost 2 years ago now as a strategic consultant. And the focus for me has been to examine and understand the landscape as it relates to unaccompanied minors, but more broadly, Casey Family Programs as a team, but also as a board of directors and as the president, have also initiated an unprecedented landscape, but also strategy for the for Latino families and children in the US and Puerto Rico as well. And a slice of what I'm going to share today is really focused on my work with them, which is around unaccompanied minors here in the US. And so, you know, one of the things that I think is important to note, and a lot of this has been, we've been doing interviews, conducting interviews of families, not necessarily unaccompanied minors due to human subjects protocols, but heads of households who have also migrated to the US from Central America and their children to understand you know, what some of the needs are with regard to services, with regard to programs and other initiatives that are needed, but also helping us to understand, looking at it from a social determinants of health framework. And for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with the social determinants of health, these are factors or potentially risk factors in many ways that impact a family's ability to thrive and to be able to, you know, be united as a family and to be able to reach the goals that they want to reach. And these include environmental factors, health factors, mental health factors, housing, a series of different factors that impact one's likelihood of being successful and thriving as a family. And one of the, I think, 2 points I think that I wanted to share is that in this research and this analysis, which is still ongoing, we're interviewing families in 12 different states across the US, and then there's a separate project on Puerto Rico, is that one, you know, the child welfare system, to the point that Erica was making, you know, the child welfare system does interface with unaccompanied minor children and their families. And I think there's this general feeling, just based on the research, that, you know, 90% plus of unaccompanied minor children end up getting reunified with their families or next of kin or something along those lines. But the fact of the matter is that what we're seeing is that there's a lot of children as well that enter the foster care system that are part of the child welfare system in the different states across the country. And what we're seeing, I think, is that, you know, there is definitely a need for the sort of a multi-sectoral approach, a holistic approach to making sure that lawyers are at the table, but that social workers are at the table, child welfare advocates, you know, judges, et cetera, that it's a whole effort model, because you can't just silo it in this sort of really sort of complicated, I would say, complicated system, which is a child welfare system. And so one of the things that I think KC Family Programs is very intentional about and is really interested in doing is to not only advocate on behalf of children that are in the child welfare system or unaccompanied minors in particular, but that to also bring together these different actors, whether they're nonprofit actors that are working on these issues, particularly on the reunification task force, and also working with ORR and these different federal agencies to really influence the way in which, for example, in these detention centers, you know, to make sure that the conditions are right and that children are protected, and that eventually, right, the goal is reunification, but that even after reunification, that there are post-release, that there are also services that take into account all of the trauma that has been experienced, not only by the child, but by the family unit itself, as they start to reunify, because that's an area I think that a lot of people also miss. Is it's not only about these different stages of the reunification process, but it's also equally important to ensure that even after they're reunified, that there are these social safety net programs, but also services that by and large are generally provided by local governments, right? Or state governments that are more receptive to providing those type of services. And so we're looking at, you know, different states and looking at different legislation and different ways in which these states affirmatively provide these services for unaccompanied minors. And the last thing I would say is that school-based interventions, I think, are also very critical as unaccompanied minors reintegrate or quote unquote integrate with their family units and reunify with their family units. We've seen a lot of great models when it comes to school-based services, mental health services, all these different wraparound services that not only education, right, that schools are supposed to do, or that's their primary responsibility, but really thinking about it in a holistic way to ensure that they get health services, mental health services, and all the different wraparound services that will be important for them to thrive. So those are the three areas that I wanted to cover in my presentation. I have more things to share in terms of recommendations and the call to action, which I think we're going to get to next. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a very complex system, right? And part of it is like, how do we dissect it, and how are we able collectively not only to pinpoint, the issues and the challenges, but what are some of the things that we as people who are very, obviously interested in this issue and are really passionate about this issue, what are the ways in which we as a collective can really advocate for their well-being? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for providing just another lens and another layer to just how complicated the situation really is. As we move into, I want to shift gears just a little bit. Thanks everybody for sharing what you've been doing, what you're seeing, and what you're learning about what the situation is like right now. And so we've talked a little bit about what it's been like for families and how you're working through all of that. But I'd like to shift a little bit to focus on to better understand what's been done by the US government, or what we can do, whether we're in philanthropy, community-based organizations, or as individuals. So I'll share some questions, and then I'll go to the first person here. But one question would be, what are some efforts or commitments that the US government has made to reunite families? And we heard a little bit about this from some folks. What are the protections or resource gaps that you're seeing? And how can we advocate and change the narrative about immigrants in general, these issues? So this time we can start with Aurora from Cielo, if you'd love to share a little bit more about what you're seeing around efforts or protections, or how we can advocate to change the narrative.
Thank you. I think right now, just because the struggle is to get data and get the numbers for how many of the migrants are coming from Indigenous communities. There isn't yet anything concretely done around that. However, I do feel like we can definitely advocate for just having interpretation ready in every step of the way. And that starts from everyone who works with, especially unaccompanied minors, who work with families, social workers. I know here in LA County, there has been a motion for DCFS to have a language access plan implemented, just due to different families who have faced barriers, Indigenous families. I know there's been Anjobal family that has struggled with language access here in LA County, where there is many Indigenous families. The other thing I think that would be just something to advocate for is just having staff understand the diversity of communities. There are cultural awareness workshops, just also understanding how each of the languages have variants. I know that there are sometimes a common misconception that Indigenous languages are dialects of Spanish, which creates this idea that Indigenous people will understand Spanish. However, knowing a couple of words, knowing a couple of prayers, does not mean that someone will understand a whole process. Someone will understand legal terminology or medical terminology. And this is why there's a big distrust when it comes to families. This creates even more barriers for families to reach out, because it's the system has failed us. Whenever we reach out with all the resources, there's really never, I haven't really ever seen any like language access plan on how to assist Indigenous folks who do not understand Spanish, who do not understand English. And I think one of the things that we can definitely commit to is just to become more aware of the diversity of the communities, the languages, and recognizing when folks do need interpretation, because there is a huge stigma. I feel like everywhere, but in Guatemala, just speaking for that, the history of Guatemala has shown that Indigenous folks are treated as second class. There is not a lot of opportunity to higher education, and there's a lot of racism. So if you only speak an Indigenous language, you are definitely targeted. You're targeted in a violent way, not only from gang violence, but as well as being displaced by companies, transnational companies, displacing communities. So I think it's just really important to note that understanding the history where these families come from, why it might there's some hesitation to reach out, is because of the history of violence that these countries have committed to these communities. Not too long ago, in Guatemala, there was a civil war, which displaced 1 million Indigenous folks to different, not only internally, but externally. And that trauma still lives within families. So a lot of the healing is needed. And with this healing, it's also there also needs to be some kind of just commitment to doing it in a culturally sensitive framework. Especially with generational trauma among Indigenous communities. And I think one of the main things that we can do that in is just being more committed and aware with just like the diversity of the community, the history, and just being able to be an ally and speaking up when we see that, instead of, a lot of the times that I've seen is when something is information is being given in Spanish, it's the default language. But if we become more aware that the diversity of the migration communities that are coming over, that there is different languages, I think that's when we can start creating less barriers, creating that data framework, and being able to bridge those gaps and help just different families, especially Indigenous families. Thank you.
Thanks, Aurora, for pointing that out, that we can speak up and make sure that all communities are being heard, that they have what they need. With that, I'd like to come back to Linda, and again, to see if you have anything further to share around either protection or resource gaps, how we can advocate or change the narrative, or if you have more to say around the effort or the commitments that the U.S. has made to reunite families. And we'll ask the presenters on this second go around for questions to just keep their answers brief. We do want to make sure folks have time to answer their questions, to ask questions of the panelists at the end. So with that, Linda.
Sure, yeah. I do think that there is a moment now to also advocate for, just better practice when it comes to, health and human services, ORR, how they can also work, hand in hand with, child advocates, with social workers, with a lot of different actors that are a part of this. And so that's one, is sort of advocating for, better practices in many different settings, including, emergency intake centers, which I know that Casey Family Programs has been very involved in. The second thing I would say is that we also need, I think, more funding. And here's my pitch for the funders that are out there. There is definitely a need for trauma-informed services, for child services to protect these children in the different settings that they'll ultimately be in, especially as it relates to foster care and kids that are a part of the child welfare system, because I think there is a gap now where we're still learning more about, what happens to the 10% or more that don't necessarily end up being reunified with a family member or next of kin. So these are children and youth that become part of the system. And so for the, I think, philanthropic community that's involved in child welfare or involved in child well-being generally, this would be an opportunity, I think, to also double down and invest in, making sure that unaccompanied minors are also a part of the investment, not only short-term but long-term. And I guess a third one would be just another quick pitch would be really doubling down also for people who are really interested in education and making investments in education. I mean, ultimately, as we know, these children will end up in our public school systems or our private school systems or our educational system writ large. And so I think part of it is thinking about, what is that nexus between providing, educational supports and these different wraparound services that I've mentioned, so that those children and youth will be able to thrive also in these different educational settings as well. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Linda. I appreciate connecting that to education. It's true. Everything we see in society ends up in our public schools or different school systems. So for folks who support education, here's another way to connect to that work. With that, we can move to Dora. If you can share a little bit more about if there's anything more you wanted to say around supporting separated families or any of the other risks. So to you, Dora.
Bueno, gracias. Como hablé anteriormente, ¿verdad? Es un esfuerzo encontrar y buscar a estos padres en aldeas remotas del país. Y cuando encontramos estas familias podemos ver lo que ellos están viviendo, y que a pesar de que ya pasaron 3, 4 años de lo sucedido, ellos aún guardan secuelas. Entonces, pienso que es importante que estas personas tengan un apoyo psicológico, un apoyo social llegando a Estados Unidos, como alojamiento, acceso a documentos para poder trabajar, porque a veces este tipo de documentos, como el permiso de trabajo, tarda mucho tiempo y estos padres no pueden encontrar trabajos o no se sienten seguros salir sin un permiso a trabajar. Entonces es importante considerar estas necesidades. Hay padres que no tienen, cuando llegan a Estados Unidos no tienen dónde ir, entonces también necesitan un apoyo para el alojamiento. Igual, como dije, es muy importante el apoyo psicológico, no tanto solo para el padre o para el niño, sino que para el núcleo familiar. He visitado familias en las cuales he visto el daño que esto les ha causado. Incluso encontré una familia donde la mamá prácticamente, ella quedó con un trauma psicológico severo. Esta señora tenía sus momentos de alegría, pero su mayor tiempo ella tenía que estar medicada a raíz del hecho de pensar que su hijo no lo iba a volver a ver. También hay padres que han manifestado que incluso sintieron el deseo de suicidarse cuando sufrieron esta separación. Entonces, sí es cierto, ya pasó un tiempo, pero esa cicatriz está ahí. Y a veces es necesario hablarlo. Tuve una entrevista con un padre que él empezó a contarme toda su historia, lloraba como un niño, y cuando terminó, él me dijo de que él agradecía mucho el tan solo hecho que se le haya escuchado, porque eso lo tenía él guardado y no tenía cómo decirlo. Entonces, o a quién decírselo, o a alguien que lo escuchara sin cuestionarlo. Entonces, son cosas que viven los padres, las diferentes familias. Cada familia ha sufrido un trauma similar, pero de una manera diferente, ¿verdad? Entonces considero que es importante estos puntos, como el adaptarse. Los padres llegan a un país de un idioma completamente diferente y a veces eso también es bien difícil. Entonces son tipos de apoyos que los padres deberían de tener al llegar a Estados Unidos y tener un apoyo también en sus países de origen. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Dora, por esos detalles más que nos has dado. I'd like to come to Erica. If you could share a little bit more about how else we might be able to advocate or change the narrative. I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. I'm so glad that everyone else went before me, but I just really want to reiterate the need for funding for holistic support for families before they are reunified, when they are in home country, but also after they arrive in the United States, and that programming needs to be culturally sensitive, recognizing that Indigenous people have been disproportionately affected by family separation. Just really quickly, like some legal advocacy that we can do is pushing to expand the definition of a family unit. As I mentioned earlier, because that definition is so narrow, we still continue to see thousands of family separations on the border. And I think as a community, resisting the justification of separation based on criminal convictions. We saw during Zero Tolerance, that entire program was built on justifying separations based on convictions for illegal entry. And we still see those separations happening. So we really can't turn our backs on parents who are separated because they are criminally prosecuted if we want to stop family separation overall. And I think we just really can't be complacent, even though there is a family reunification task force. There's a lot of gaps. They're not covering costs for all family members. So it's actually causing additional separation. Parents have to make the choice of leaving some family members behind if they're reunifying through the task force. And really the only support that they're getting are from nonprofit organizations like Justice in Motion, like Al Otro Lado, like Kind, for example. Just in terms of changing the narrative, again, going for that like broader definition of family, but then just really understanding that this is not over, right? There's thousands of families still being separated, new forms of separation occurring. And the longer it takes, even to just reunify families affected by zero tolerance, the more likely it is that political leadership will change and even those reunifications will stop. And just finally, you know, the zero tolerance was a blatant torture for these families. No one in the government has been held accountable. And that's something that we need to focus on. We shouldn't see the Family Reunification Task Force as them doing us a favor. These families have a right to be together, and we need to keep that mindset when we are, you know, fighting for greater justice for these families. And then just final thing is going back to something Dora mentioned, is really advocating for permanent status for families that are being reunified through the task force. Right now, they're only being given a 3-year parole. Many are justifiably worried about being separated or removed to danger. And so really just as a community, we need to stay strong in advocating for permanent legal status for those families. So thank you.
Thank you so much, all of our panelists for sharing their wealth of knowledge with us. I want to open it up a little bit to folks that are still with us. Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask any of our panelists? Would love to hear from you on any of the things that we've just discussed. While you're thinking of that, I can ask our panelists, I saw some in the chat there, some things you wanted to mention. Were there things that you wanted to get out that you didn't get a chance to get out? This is your chance. So I don't know if Linda, you wanted to share something more, or if there's somebody else on the panel who wanted to share something more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that one of the observations, at least that we're seeing with a lot of the work that we're doing, is that, okay, good, somebody's unmuted, is that, you know, the whole issue of legal representation, and I know Erica could speak to this more, but it's so important, both not only for, you know, the unaccompanied minor and the, you know, making sure that they have that legal representation, but looking at it from a holistic sort of whole family approach, because everyone's, you know, doesn't necessarily have the same status, for example, right? So I think that's one thing that everyone should consider, is the fact that, you know, we're talking about families that are very intergenerational as well. So they're not just nuclear families of, you know, let's just say a mom, a dad, and 2 children, for example, but that there is an extended sort of family unit structure in many cases, and that legal representation obviously is critical for all the things that we've been talking about, right? In terms of getting access to an employment authorization card, or whether it's leading up to the path of citizenship or whatever that may be. Having a lawyer is very critical. And I think the work that so admirable, the work that El Otro Lado is doing and others that are on this panel really speaks to, you know, the sheer sort of not only passion, but the volume of cases that they've been able to work on, and the need for additional resources to help support these families and children.
Thank you so much, Linda. I see Elba has a question. So if Elba, you want to come off mute, feel free to ask your question.
Sí, muchas gracias. Pues en realidad más que una pregunta, no era una pregunta, sino un poco compartir rápidamente, escuchando a las diferentes ponencias, como solo contribuir con un par de puntos. Yo colaboro con KAIN México, hay KAIN en Estados Unidos, y pues un poco también compartirles de este trabajo que hacemos con niñez no acompañada, justamente en la línea que acaba de señalar Linda, pero también el resto de los participantes. Y en el tema de defensa legal, pues tenemos como un trabajo muy sólido en representación de los niños, y compartir que parte del trabajo que KAIN está haciendo, por ejemplo, en México, en Frontera, en Tijuana, en Ciudad Juárez, está precisamente muy relacionada con todos estos obstáculos para que la niñez pueda siquiera presentarse en puntos de ingreso y solicitar protección. Y también la falta de asistencia legal, ¿no? Cómo está afectando no nada más, bueno, fundamentalmente niños no acompañados, centroamericanos o de diversas nacionalidades, se puede dar hasta cierto punto ese acompañamiento para que puedan presentarse en puntos de ingreso, para que puedan solicitar protección, pero no así, por ejemplo, el niñez mexicana, ¿no? Que está también buscando protección. Entonces, me parece interesante como pues visibilizar también estos retos muy particulares que presenta la niñez mexicana, tanto para asistencia legal como para acceso a los procedimientos de protección en Estados Unidos. Y otra variante tiene que ver también con cómo los sistemas de protección en México, los sistemas de protección a niños, niñas y adolescentes, y estos cambios legislativos que se han producido tendrían que ser también un mecanismo para evaluar la reunificación o la protección en un tercer país seguro. Eso es parte del trabajo que también hemos observado, ¿no? La posibilidad de que las determinaciones en México respondan al interés superior, en el sentido de no solo decidir el retorno, sino la reunificación o la protección en Estados Unidos. Entonces también ahí hay un área como muy fuerte de trabajo, y que también se engancha con el tema de asistencia y defensa legal de todos esos niños que también están buscando, que son menos, pero también están buscando reunificación en México o están buscando protección en México, y que estos sistemas, pues el sistema migratorio, el sistema de protección a refugiados y el sistema migratorio están teniendo como muchos choques y enfrentamientos para efectivamente asegurar los derechos, permitir la participación. Lo que comentaban hace un momento es también fundamental. Entonces, ¿cómo también podemos pensar en ampliar la asistencia y la defensa legal en México y fortalecer los sistemas de protección a efecto de que aquellos niños que tengan posibilidades de reunificación en Estados Unidos puedan llevarse a cabo esas reunificaciones a partir de las determinaciones que realiza la autoridad competente en México, en este caso las procuradurías. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Elba, por sus comentarios. También, miro, I see in the chat that we have a question here from Graciela. The question is, how do you envision the situation could change with the lifting of Title 42 regarding unaccompanied children? My question for Graciela is there a specific panelist that you want to respond to this, or any of the panelists? But the question there is in the chat, how do you envision the situation could change with the lifting of Title 42 regarding unaccompanied children?
I can take it if that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
So unaccompanied children supposedly have not been subject to Title 42 for a while, since the end of the Trump administration by court order, and then the Biden administration decided not to have it apply. There was some subsequent litigation, but right now it shouldn't apply. What we are seeing on the ground is that we have to accompany unaccompanied children to the port of entry if they are going to be admitted. Otherwise, they are turned away. And the comments that Elba just made are really relevant to this because Mexican children face a lot of discrimination. I think under Title 42 or without Title 42, there are special rules under the TVPRA that apply to Mexican children. I believe that these rules are exploited to deny admission to the vast majority. I think it's like under 5% that actually get admitted. And there's a lot of violence in Mexico, specifically targeted at adolescent males. And it's really beyond disheartening. It's tragic to see children dying here in Mexico. We have witnessed that because they are turned away from ports of entry, both Mexican and Central American children. So I would hope that things open up a little bit more because they will have humanitarian processing at the ports. However, what the policy is and what happens on the ground are often very different. And of course, we will still be here to document when there are rights violations and hopefully be able to advocate for changes at a higher level. So.
Thank you for taking that on. Are there other panelists that might want to weigh in on this particular question? Related to that question, I'll throw in a question while I see if there's anybody else that has a question. It's a timely question given that Title 14 has, the ending of it has just been announced. Do we expect an increase of migration at the border, and do we think the government's ready to respond to that?
I can talk again if no one else, sorry. I just got out of a meeting with CBP talking about this. So right now there's tens of thousands of migrants that have been blocked by Title 42 who have been waiting in shelters at the border. So there's been a lot of rhetoric in the media about a surge, and I hate that word because we're talking about human beings, but we will see a large number of people approaching the border because they've been stuck here for 2 years. So I think it's really important to keep in mind when we see that it's not chaos. And if it is, it's the government's own making. But the people that we speak to really want an orderly process and they want it to be transparent. So we will see like a larger number initially, but just with respect to that being a pull factor or us seeing an overall increase, the pandemic has really upended a lot of countries' economies. There's been obviously wars that have broken out in the interim. This is a period of one of the highest levels of migration in history. So I don't think a border policy necessarily is going to make a difference, that much of a difference in someone's decision of whether or not to flee their home. And frankly, most of the people at the border would have rather not been forced to make that decision. So when we are seeing those increases, if we do see them, I think it's important to remember that push factors are most often behind that, not the pull factor of a different border policy.
Great, thank you so much for taking that question on. Just one last question, and then I can hand off back to the HIP team. Just curious for any of the panelists, are you seeing examples of a good organizational collaboration or coordination of response efforts, especially with this increase of demand for and the complexity of services needed? Would love to hear from anybody on the panel if you're seeing or can share of some good examples of coordination or collaboration across sector, across organizations.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure I understood. You're asking a question about some model collaborations on this issue, or?
Yeah, I would be curious to know if you're seeing examples of good organizational collaboration or coordination of response effort.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll mention a couple. I mean, the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, I think, was really successful in garnering, a lot of bringing together, I guess, a lot of different advocacy groups, including child welfare advocates. I think having been in this space for a while, I find sometimes that there isn't, I guess, a lot of the sort of cross-sector collaboration that could happen or ideally should be happening with regard to both child welfare advocates, but also social workers, educators, all these different actors that are a part of this entire system. And I think that obviously we have really great examples on the legal representation side, and you have them here with you today. So there's been a significant, I think, significant role that legal organizations have played vis-a-vis ensuring, that unaccompanied minors in particular get legal representation, but also other ways that, they can integrate, or they have integrated rather, social workers, et cetera, into the legal representation model. So I think these models are shifting and changing have shifted and changed over time. And then I think on the foundation side, I mean, obviously HIP has done an incredible job of bringing funders together to really spotlight, the issues that are significant, both in terms of, the challenges and the barriers that both these children and families still face on the US-Mexico border. And there's other, of course, philanthropic, I guess, funder collaboratives that have come together to address these different issues. But I do want to say, I think there's definitely a need to include, additional funders to the table. And I guess my pitch here is that, think of this as also not only an immigration quote unquote issue, but it's really a child welfare issue, or it's a educational issue, or it's a, mental health trauma type of issue. So to the degree that, even the philanthropic community starts thinking about this in a more intersectional way, I think the better for everybody. But, we got to start somewhere. But I do think that there's a lot of room to really amplify, the number of actors and stakeholders that are a part of this whole collaborative to ensure that families and children are protected, but that they also are able to thrive in the communities that they live.
Thank you so much, Linda, for all of that, and talking about the intersection and that immigration, it's not just an issue; it's an experience that a lot of us have, and immigrants are people too. It's not just an issue, and we need to think about children and families who are both nested within their communities and how we can help to support them thrive across different educational issues or other issues where it all comes together. Just want to thank everybody on the panel so much for spending this afternoon with us and talking about the current situation related to these important issues and policies. And with that, I will turn it back over to the HIP team, but thank you so much for allowing me to be part of the conversation and to ask you all really good questions. And thank you to the audience and the folks that are participating and watching. Thanks so much.
And thank you so much, Isela, for moderating the conversation today. We really appreciate you and the role that Kellogg plays in all of this work as well. And thank you once again. I will echo Isela. Thank you so much to our speakers, Erika, Dora, Aurora, and Linda. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your personal stories and your expertise. It's the work that you are doing is incredibly important. So we really thank you for that. And thank you to GSER, our co-sponsor today. And on behalf of HIP, thank you so much to our participants for joining us today. Please be on the lookout. We will share the recording and we will share some notes to recap this great conversation. So please be on the lookout for that. It will be both in English and in Spanish. So if there are folks that you know would be interested in this conversation and you'd like to share, that will be coming soon. We also want to share our next couple of webinars coming up. One is happening tomorrow, Mobilizing for Justice. You can see this on the screen at 12 p.m. Central. We hope that folks can join us. The conversation will be with Wola. And we will also wanted to share our upcoming webinar, which will be on May 18th. And the conversation will be around the intersection of climate and migration. So once again, thank you all very much. And we hope to see you at the next one in a month from now. Muchas gracias.